Imagine you're sitting on a bus, with everyone else, the sound of the vehicle moving steadily, but your mind is wandering. As you stare at your phone, a familiar voice cuts through the silence. A stranger, none other than a woman sitting nearby, starts talking to a child. "You don't belong here." Those words, though not directed at anyone in particular, are like a cold wind blowing through the air, making you look up. The woman, with a bored look and a cold gaze, seems to want to affirm something you can't quite understand. As the bus passes through the crowded streets, you can smell the smell of damp fabric and something heavy with cheap perfume, the kind that lingers in the air long after the person gets off. The people around them continue their lives, seemingly unnoticed. Keenan, a 17-year-old, doesn't care much about such things. He was thinking about the lesson he had just learned, the teacher's words about the upcoming project. Yet there was something in the woman's voice that he couldn't ignore. How could you sit still when those words were so piercing to your ego? "You don't belong here." The words kept repeating in his head. A strange feeling welled up, an indignation he couldn't express. The stares from the people didn't help. They continued to pass by, no one standing up, no one reacting. The bus was still moving, the horns were honking outside, the red lights were flashing. You could almost feel the tension in the air. Keenan was hesitating, not knowing what to do. He wanted to ignore it, but something was telling him to react. Did he need to say something? Did he need to stand up, do something to break the silence? But before he could think, the woman's voice rang out again, this time sharper, as if wanting to end the conversation with one last sentence. "Go back to Africa." At that moment, the bus seemed to stop, not because of a red light or a car accident, but because the atmosphere inside suddenly became heavy. Everything seemed to become quiet, a long silence between the passengers. Keenan could no longer ignore it. He turned to look at the woman, his eyes meeting the woman. The atmosphere at this moment seemed to have completely changed, a conversation had begun, but this time it was not just normal words, but a test of each person's courage. Keenan felt all eyes on him. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, pretending to be engrossed in their phones. Others just stood there, watching silently, waiting to see what he would do. The man in the suit in front paused, tapping his knee gently. Even the noisy children in the back fell silent for a moment. Keenan did nothing. He sat still, his eyes fixed on the woman who had just said those words, as if they were true, as if she had the right to decide where he belonged. Part of him wanted to laugh at how ridiculous her words sounded. But the rest of him burned, not with anger, but with a strange sense of exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that comes when you've seen too much, lived through too much, and still see people like her think they're saying something new. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, as everyone waited for what would happen next. Keenan could feel each look, as if it were weighing him down. His hand tightened on the phone, but he forced himself to breathe steadily. Dorothy's expression didn't change, she sat there, back straight, waiting for him to get angry, to give her an excuse to say, "I told you so." Keenan wouldn't give her that chance, but he wasn't about to let it pass. A man near the front cleared his throat, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. A teenage girl in the back glanced at her friend, eyes wide. A woman in a navy jacket shifted uncomfortably, clutching the strap of her purse. And still no one said anything. Finally, Keenan said, "So what did you say?" His voice was calm, steady, almost too much. Dorothy sneered, folding her arms. "Did you hear me, Keenan?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on hers. "Yes, I heard. I just wanted to make sure you heard yourself." Her mouth pressed into a straight line. "I don't need to explain anything to you." "Are you sure about that?" Keenan replied, "Because I think everyone here wants to know why you think you have the right to decide where I belong." A few heads turned toward Dorothy. Someone near the front chuckled, almost nervously. She hesitated, and in that moment, Keenan realized, she hadn't expected resistance. She hadn't thought that someone like him, a child in her eyes, would dare to confront her words. But now, the whole bus was watching, and she wasn't so confident anymore. Keenan felt the change in the air. He knew that things weren't just about him anymore. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, he felt the tension surrounding him, all eyes still on him. His gaze met Dorothy's, neither of them sure what would happen next. Keenan chuckled, but his voice was steady, unwavering. "You're telling me to go back to Africa, right? Like this country doesn't belong to people like me," he said, pausing for a moment, waiting for a response. But Dorothy didn't respond right away, her lips pursed slightly, as if weighing each word. Keenan didn't pause, he continued, leaning forward slightly. "So where do you think your ancestors came from? Did they just spring from this soil?" There was a brief silence in the air, a few murmurs spreading through the bus. Keenan caught a slight nod from the person sitting near the front, a silent confirmation from those who understood. "My ancestors didn't have a choice," Keenan said, his voice no longer as gentle as it had been, but firm. "They were captured, brought here in chains. But they built this country. Every brick, every road, and everything you take for granted today, it was the work of the Black Hand." Dorothy let out a laugh, but it was a bitter laugh, unable to hide the hurt. "Oh, come on," she muttered. But Keenan wouldn't let her off the hook. He cut her off. "No, you can't act like history never happened, just because it makes you uncomfortable." Silence fell over the bus. Keenan could hear the engine, the heaviness in the air. He continued, his voice softer, as if he had completely shed his hard outer shell. "The problem isn't that I don't belong here, it's that you don't know how to share space, don't understand that this isn't yours alone." Dorothy sat there, her face contorted into an expression Keenan couldn't read. She was angry, ashamed, but there was nothing left to say. The silence was not hers alone, but everyone else on the bus. The air was so thick, so heavy, you could feel it. Dorothy's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but nothing came. All her life she had said things like that, believing that no one would argue, but now faced with a truth she could not deny, she had no words. Keenan didn't move, he just sat there, no smirk, no gloating. He just looked at her, waiting patiently. And then, finally, a voice from the front said, "He's right." The voice was soft but firm. Another voice from behind, "Have you ever noticed that the loudest people are often the ones who understand the least?" A woman near the middle of the bus shook her head, tired, as if she were used to arguments like this. Dorothy's shoulders tensed, and she looked around and realized the focus of the conversation had changed. It was no longer just her and Keenan. Everyone on the bus was involved. A feeling of loneliness and uncertainty washed over her. For the first time, she was unsure of herself. Not that anything big had changed, but something small. Dorothy sat quietly in her seat, her eyes fixed on one spot, her lips pursed. Maybe she would get off this bus, continue as usual. Maybe she wouldn't, but the others wouldn't. They had seen something, heard something, and maybe, the next time they were in a situation like this, they wouldn't keep quiet. Keenan sighed, feeling the weight of everything lighten a little as the bus continued to roll. The city outside flashed by in a rush of motion, signs, traffic lights, neon-lit stores. Keenan leaned back, his head against the window, his heartbeat slowly returning to normal. But he could still feel the residue, the warmth of the moment pressing against his skin. No one said anything more. Not to Dorothy, not to him. But something had changed. He felt it, after a few stops. The man in the construction vest stood up, gripping the handrail as the bus slowed before stepping off. He glanced at Keenan and nodded, a brief but meaningful nod that said more than words could. The bus door clicked shut behind him. Keenan noticed the teenage girl sitting near the back whispering to her friend. She glanced at Dorothy and muttered, "I hope I never have to." Dorothy didn't react, but her face lost some of its certainty. Keenan turned away, no longer looking at her. He had said what he needed to say. Whether she understood or not was none of his business. As the bus neared his stop, Keenan stood up, grabbing his backpack. He could feel the eyes on him, some sympathetic, some concerned, and some uncertain, unsure of what he had just witnessed. The bus doors opened with a hiss, and as he stepped onto the sidewalk, a female voice called from behind, "Hey." He turned, saw the woman in the navy blue jacket. She looked at him for a moment, then smiled softly. "You handled it well." Keenan didn't answer right away. He just nodded, not in pride or triumph, but because he understood something in that moment. Today wasn't about closing doors for one person, it was about making everyone think. The bus pulled away, the engine fading into the background. Keenan took a breath, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and started walking down the sidewalk. Tomorrow, the world would be the same. There would be more Dorothys, more moments like this. But today, on that bus, something had changed. And sometimes, that's how change begins. Because silence keeps things the same. But when you speak, that's when things begin to change. If you've come this far, ask yourself, what would you do? Would you speak up, or would you stay quiet, hoping someone else would handle it for you? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if this story has made you think, please share it. Because conversations like this need to happen. The story of the racist woman who told the black student, "Go back to Africa," and his response that left the crowd speechless is a powerful and meaningful story. It not only reflects the injustice and racism, but also demonstrates the resilience, pride, and patience of the oppressed. The woman's statement reflects the racist attitude, ignorance, and contempt for people of other races. However, the black student's response is a testament to the power of intelligence, dignity, and confidence. His response not only responded intelligently, but also made people think about profound issues such as human rights, equality, and tolerance. When the crowd was speechless, it was then that they realized that racism only drives people apart, and that unity, respect, and love among peoples are the most important things. This story reminds us that in a challenging world, every individual has the right to be proud of who they are, regardless of where they come from or the color of their skin. The black student's response is not just a protest against one individual, but a powerful and inspiring voice for all those who face discrimination. This story shows that despite the hardships and injustices of the world, we can still stand strong and defend our own dignity.